Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Ask Ralph the Evaluator. And I'm Ralph the Evaluator. Today's question, the genesis for today's question came from a recent webinar I gave to the Translational Research Evaluation Group for AEA. That's their TIG. And it had to do with using stacked logic models. So there was definitely some concern around that, not understanding why stacked logic models were like okay, but really missing the mark actually when it comes to evaluating these Centers for Translational Research. So I put together a little PowerPoint. I'm going to walk you through what the challenges are and why using stacked logic models, as I said, it's a step in the right direction, but we're still missing the mark. So let me just get this up and going here. And we'll all right. So Centers for Translational Research, they're funded by the NIH. The CTRs, as they're known, are very similar in design to many other NIH-funded initiatives that are basically looking to provide support to clinicians to pursue research and moving it from the bench to the bedside, as they say, or out into the community. The basic design, they're all very similar. They have these different support cores. The CTR that I was working in had these particular cores plus the tracking and evaluation core. Each core provides some level of support, as the name suggests, to clinicians as they try to embark on becoming independent researchers. Now, the NIH, when you read their notice of funding opportunity, with respect to the outcome evaluation, I'm going to focus more on that today because the logic models relate to the outcome evaluation rather than the process evaluation. But what they are asking for each of those cores is a logic model, and then reporting more or less on outputs, the publications, the funding, those kinds of things that a clinician would be able to secure. And those outputs are evidence of the success of the program. So in this kind of a worldview, asking for logic models, it's kind of an independent worldview. So each core is seen as independent from the other cores because you're developing a separate logic model for each core. So that's pretty straightforward, not rocket science there at all. But what does that really look like? So here we have all the cores, and you're basically building a logic model for each core. Now, on this call, some of you were quite right in noticing the disconnect between the intervention design, the stated intervention design by NIH in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and the actual evaluation strategy. So I went through and I found 24 references that referred to the cores, those different support cores, being dependent on each other. Keywords like collaborating and partnering, promoting multi-directional engagement are all indications that these cores are not operating independently at all, but are somehow operating dependently or are supposed to work with each other in some way. And there's even in there a reference to this higher order outcome with this keyword synergize with existing strengths. So many of you picked up on that. Good for you. And you said, the design perhaps looks something more like this. And this might be an oversimplification, but here I'm just showing all the different support cores within the CTR that I was evaluating, and just trying to depict here that they're all interrelated and communicating with each other. So when confronted with that particular situation, many of you will and have done the following. You know how to use the logic model. You're like, oh, great, I know how to use that. And well, now I'm just going to take what I know how to do, the logic model, and I'm going to apply that to this new situation. And that's the old, well, if everything is a hammer, if you have all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Pardon me there. I almost did a George Bush, didn't I? I can't get the sayings right, the expressions correct. So you know how to do a logic model, and you're like, okay, I recognize there's a different situation, but I'm still going to apply my logic model to try to make this work. So what you essentially had was this situation, right, with all the logic models, and you've said, we're going to do this. We're going to stack these logic models and show how each of these cores contributes to some outcome. So we went from here, all these different outcomes, and you said, I can be very clever, and I'm going to show how they all relate to this outcome. And as I said before, good for you, one step in the right direction, but this still doesn't cut it in terms of an evaluation, given the design of the CTR. And let me explain why. So why do they fall short? The first is, well, you're still assuming, even if you have multiple stacked logic models, that they're operating independently and make independent contributions to the outcome. And this is absolutely false. Okay, this isn't correct. That's not how the CTR was designed or intended to operate. And let me explain this in a little more detail, because this was a source of confusion during the webinar. If you're using stacked logic models, basically you're seeing the world this way. Okay, so if I go back to here, here's your stacked logic models, right? And the translation of that is this. Essentially, what you're saying is that each particular core is responsible for some component that's going to help clinicians be successful in getting grants and publications. So in a reductionist world, what happens is you start on the right-hand side here and you say, well, what are the barriers to getting grants and publications? And in the reductionist world, you're looking for the different causes of that. And you'll say, well, why does this particular barrier exist? And one is, well, maybe they don't understand how to write a grant. And there may be other reasons for that. I'm just oversimplifying the cause and effect here. You could go further back in this causal chain if you wanted, by continuing to ask why. And that is sort of the reductionist paradigm. Another reason is they could lack statistical knowledge. They may lack entree into the community to do research. They may lack access to tissue samples to do some research. That would be the bench research, and the entree to the community would be the sort of the T4 level. They may just lack colleagues or mentors with expertise in the area that they need to connect to. And so when you're stacking these logic models, you're saying, hey, guess what? Our cores can handle each and every one of these different things. It may be that the clinical research and resources core in our CTR was able to get access to tissue samples for folks. Our biostats core was helping folks with statistical knowledge and so forth. But this is essentially, when you're stacking the logic model, this is what the program logic is that's underpinning each of those logic models, right? This is the program theory for each logic model. And you're trying, again, to be clever and to show that, well, all of these contribute to getting grants and publications. And it's true, they are, but your assumption that they're doing this independently and make independent contributions is what is in error. So each logic model is still based in the reductionist cause and effect worldview. And that cause and effect thinking leads to kind of this if-then logic. So let me give you another example here to try to make this clear. So this is your classic KSA. You see this in public health a lot, where a change in knowledge leads to a change in skills, leads to a change in attitude. And this KSA is derived from a root cause analysis approach, where there's a particular behavior that you're trying to change. Well, why isn't that behavior changing? You say, well, that's because the attitude's wrong. Well, why is the attitude wrong? Well, they don't have the skills. Why is the skill wrong? Well, they don't have the knowledge. So it's kind of this working backwards again, knowledge, skills, attitude. It's this if-then logic. And no matter how many logic, so this is sort of for one logic model, right? That's kind of like the thinking. It's still there, the reductionist view, this chronological, if one leads to another. And this is kind of your logic, your stacked logic model kind of view of things. And this is how that same KSA would be looked at from a stacked logic model perspective. And no matter how many logic models you stack, each still has an if-then assumptions sort of associated with it. And you're still making the assumption that each of those cores, one would be responsible for knowledge, skills, or attitude, is making some kind of independent contribution to that outcome, in this case, competence. So is it better than this? Yes. You're showing multiple now and how they come together, but it's still not this, right? This is what we're trying to get at. We're trying to get at this synergistic effect of these different cores, or in this case, if we had one core for attitude, skills, and knowledge, what are they synergistically trying to produce? What are they trying to, what emerges from their interactions that neither one of them can produce independently? In this case, it might be ability. Now, in the case of our CTR, we didn't define it as ability, we defined it as the researcher self-efficacy. All the cores were working together. No core can create the confidence in a researcher to move forward and produce a quality grant, but all the cores in the pieces that they provide and how they coordinate with each other can actually produce researcher self-efficacy. So that's the first real problem that you have. The second problem is that the logic models themselves actually reinforce a siloed culture. So we as evaluators may be inadvertently undermining the intervention itself, right? Because of the logic models that we create. This particular pyramid is borrowed from the Haynes Institute. I love this. Louis Atkinson, shout out to you. But here we have at the bottom of this pyramid, culture and commitment. Every system, every complex intervention, right? Its success depends on the culture. And if we want to have a culture of cores collaborating interdependently with each other, right? Then if we create logic models, we're inadvertently doing the opposite, right? We are reinforcing cores for meeting their own outcomes. It's like, well, geez, we got to meet these outcomes. And they're really not going to necessarily be rewarded for thinking about how what they do, their workflow or their standard operating procedures impact other cores. So again, when we create the stacked logic models, yes, we have the first problem, which is that doesn't actually reflect the design. It's not true that all of those particular cores act independently to produce that outcome. That's simply not the case. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But it's also not reinforcing a culture of interdependence. Sorry, I tripped over that own word. But let me come back to just a moment here to this idea of the outcome, which I kind of forgot to mention. So I want to come back to this. And, so it's easy for me to say, yeah, we're assuming they each contribute independently, but let me give you a practical example of how ridiculous this logic is. So all of you know that one of the most challenging pieces to get through, initial challenging pieces anyway, is to secure IRB approval, right? Your internal review board. Now, to get IRB approval, that clinician is going to have to, first of all, understand that that's part of writing a grant. They're going to have some statistical knowledge because the IRB is going to want to see sample size and how you're handling people. If they're trying to get into the community, there are definitely going to be components there that they need help from the community outreach core. And these folks need to work together with each other to help that particular clinician put together a good IRB application, right? They have to coordinate with each other, and they can't possibly even operate independently to be able to help that person get across the finish line with respect to getting IRB approval. It's just not possible. The community outreach people would have to be able to work with the biostatistician to understand what the subject characteristics are, where they are, how many you can actually recruit, and so forth. How that gets written into the grant is going to be really important, and so forth. So even just with a simple IRB, getting IRB approval, it already requires the coordination, and no one core by itself is going to be able to get that IRB approval or provide the knowledge to the clinician or the tools to the clinician to be able to get that IRB approval. It has to be coordinated in some way. So just from a practical standpoint, this does not reflect the operational reality of what's going on in a CTR. So I digress. We were talking about the siloed culture, and let me go here. So I hope you can see that why the stacked logic models aren't a good solution. And so the question is, what is a better approach? And I've been making the case that I think systems thinking is probably a better approach. The CTR is a complex intervention in my mind. By complex, I mean it has many moving parts. And so systems by their nature have a lot of moving parts. So, it seems reasonable to think anyway, right, that if we could apply what we know about systems to evaluating complex interventions, because they kind of have the same characteristics. But that systems approach only works if that complex intervention actually meets what I call the system test. So we have to make sure that, because just because it has a lot of moving parts, right, and that's like, okay, good, that's kind of what systems have. They have a lot of moving parts, but were they really those parts? Do they meet the system definition? And that system definition is highlights two important properties: this idea of interdependence and emergence. And the idea of interdependence is, are those different parts actually interdependent on each other? Meaning that they cannot produce their intended effect, this emergent property, unless they are actually working together with each other. So let me give you an example of interdependence and emergence, because I didn't really explain it that well, but hopefully if I ramble on for another 30 seconds or so, it'll be clearer as to what I meant. So we take a timepiece. You can see all the different cogs there in the timepiece. If you were to take any one of those cogs out of that timepiece, the clock would no longer work. So each piece is truly interdependent on the other to be able to function. Okay. And I want to come back to just a second to interdependence and collaboration. Make a note of that right here, because they're not the same thing either, and people confuse those. But so these parts are definitely interdependent, because if you take any piece out, then the clock won't work. Well, when they're all working together interdependently, what emerges? What emerges is the ability to tell time. And the ability to tell time, no single piece of that clock can do that on its own, right? It's impossible. Any one clock that would not, if it was just by itself, would not be able to tell time. And they're all needed, and they're all interdependent to be able to tell time. So that's great. But does the CTR pass that system test? And I would argue that it does, because of those references to core dependencies that we talked about earlier and the references to synergy that we talked about early. So I would say it passes the system test. So great. So we have now looked at a particular intervention. In this case, it's the Center for Translational Research, and the cores are the intervention. It's got multiple cores, so that meets sort of the first requirement of a system, and they are interdependent on each other. Great. So now we're somewhat confident that a systems approach is the best way to go. So what would the systems approach be if we focused in on those two properties? What would be the value added of that systems approach relative to the stacked models? Well, the first, from a process standpoint, is this, right? We're actually focused in on getting those interdependencies. What I've noticed in some of the CTR evaluations is when they're focused on the process, they are focused, not a surprise, right? Because if you got these logic models and you're treating them independently, you tend to also just evaluate the workflow of particular cores independently as well. So how well are they executing what they said they want to do. Are they meeting their individual milestones? You know, those kinds of things. So you're missing completely the connections between these cores in terms of how they operate. And what you're missing is, if you are, let's say some of you did make the case, well, we are evaluating those connections between them. Well, how are you evaluating those? And some of you said, well, we're looking at whether they collaborate. And I would say, well, collaboration is okay, but collaboration is not necessarily interdependence, right? It sounds good. We're collaborating. Yeah, that's good. You're communicating, you're cooperating, you're collaborating with other cores. That is definitely what they should be doing, but they need to be also thinking interdependently. And I think that's collaboration at a deeper level. That's understanding that if I make a change in the admin core to one of my workflows, or I want to make a change, I need to be thinking how that's going to impact the other cores that I'm working with. And how does my change influence what they do in their workflows? And that's truly the thinking interdependently. Really caring about and understanding that we're all in this together, and that all of us are needed to be successful, and that any changes that I make to how I do my work is going to possibly affect how you do your work and affect us as a whole. And that is way deeper than just collaboration. And from an outcome standpoint, the value added of the systems approach is you're going to be trying to get at what's called this emergent outcome. So going back a few slides, the knowledge, skills, ability, or knowledge, skills, attitude, the emergent property would have been ability. Here in our CTR, as I mentioned earlier, we were looking at researcher self-efficacy. However that's defined, you got to maybe work with your leadership to do that. But this idea of an emergent property is very different, right? Very different than a long-term outcome. The long-term outcome has sort of a chronology associated with it, right? There's this idea that you go from immediate to intermediate to long-term, and that changes in the long-term outcome will only happen if changes to the intermediate happen, and changes to the intermediate will only happen if there's changes to the immediate. And again, it's that reductionist thinking, that if-then. This is saying, no, there is no chronology to this. It's that they're all working interdependently. And when it works, it almost as though research self-efficacy in this case, or the emergent property, appears. It's a very different kind of thinking and a very different kind of outcome that you'll then get. So if we recognize that we want to get to that systems approach, then we need some kind of evaluation approach that's aligned with the logic of that intervention design, right? And we need something that's what we would say fit for purpose. And this is where I noticed that in terms of methods, one of the things that we lacked in evaluation were methods to help us actually do this and this, right? To get at these interdependencies and to get at this emergent property. We don't really have the methods to be able to do that. And that's where why I developed the book Systems Evaluation Theory. And it really is, as it says, a blueprint for helping you evaluate those complex interventions. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what that is. Consists of 3 steps. The first step is we define the system, or in this case, if I could reword it, I would have said the complex intervention. There's different system concepts that help you do that, like this idea of boundaries, scales, and levels and parts. And I think the value added here of this particular framework is these things, boundaries, scale, levels, are often talked about, ironically, independently, right? So, and out of context. And so I was able to say, well, where do these particular concepts come in handy from an application standpoint in evaluation? And they come in handy right at the beginning, where you actually have to define the evaluand, the thing that you're evaluating, in this case, the complex intervention. And then step 2, we're talking about evaluating the interdependencies. And that necessarily precedes evaluating step 3, the emergence, because you need interdependence before you can get emergence. So there's some rationale there. Within step 2, evaluating interdependencies or evaluating the system efficiency. Again, there's many system concepts, and each of those concepts, cascading events, reworks, reflex arcs, and feedback loops, are just different ways of thinking about interdependencies. So they just help you when you're evaluating your intervention to be able to look at those interdependencies in different ways and to be able perhaps catch different types of inefficiencies. And then finally, yeah, evaluating the effectiveness of the emergence. So, and that relates to the concept of holism, but, and that captures this idea in the CTR of this synergy and what's the synergistic effect that they're trying to get at. So it's just a simple 3-step framework that you can work through. In the book, I actually have a couple examples related back to evaluating the CTR. So that could be helpful for some of you. And just to summarize where we're at here with this whole thing with stacked logic models. Look, here's sort of your simple logic model, right? It's kind of, oh, and first of all, I should give credit to this particular diagram to the Haynes Institute. Again, Louis and the Haynes Institute shared this diagram with me. It's just brilliant. So thank you to them. But when we're doing logic models, we're in that reductionist world. Many of you recognize when you're evaluating these CTRs or other complex interventions that, hey, that's not good enough. And you kind of get here with this partial systems thinking, where you're kind of getting at this idea of collaboration and cooperation, right? But you're not getting at the idea of interdependence. And you've decided that, hey, if we stack the logic models, that's a step forward. But really, let's be honest, you're just using a tool that you know how to use and trying to make it work. And it's wrong. You just shouldn't be doing that. And the better approach is to actually match the actual evaluation approach to the actual intervention design. And in this case, it truly is, CTRs are truly meant to operate as a system, interdependent cores, and therefore you need an approach that's helpful for that, that's aligned to the system definition of interdependence and emergence, and that's what system evaluation theory or SET does. So you may want to sign up for a book club. We found these super useful. Here's some contact information. I'd really appreciate it if you also went on to YouTube and searched Ask Ralph the Evaluator, all one word, Ask Ralph the Evaluator, and yeah, sign up to my YouTube channel and I'll keep the content coming. And if you have other questions, please, by all means, you can reach out on the website or reach out by email, ask me your questions, and I will do my best to create some more content for the channel. And I appreciate your support in the book club, and this YouTube channel. Thanks.